Okay, hello and welcome to Redspin's April CMMC Connect. My name's Lauren. I'm delighted to be your behind-the-scenes host for today's event. Before we begin, I'd like to say thank you all for joining us. We're so glad you're here. A few quick housekeeping notes. First, this is an open environment intended to create a two-way conversation. Please feel free to come off mute and on camera. Next, this is an Ask Me Anything style presentation. The majority of our time today will be spent answering your questions. We're going to begin with answering questions that were submitted during the registration process. Then we'll host a live Q&A. You can either type your questions in the Q&A box or raise your hand and Jeremy and I will unmute your microphone for you to ask your questions live. Last, I know you're probably wondering, yes, a replay of this session and the slides will be shared within 48 hours. Okay, now I'd like to turn to our panel for introductions. We have Thomas Graham, VP and CISO of Redspin, Jeremy Mayers, VP of Sales, who will be moderating questions and the chat, and Robert Teague, Director of CMMC Services. With that, Jeremy, I will turn it over to you to get started.
Excellent. First, I just want to thank everybody for taking time out of their day to spend it with us. As Lauren said, this is intended to be a back and forth open forum. So the more folks that we have and the questions that you have, the better dialogues that we have all together. So with that said, let's dive into the pre-submitted questions first. So one of the questions that was submitted was regarding screening of employees prior to authorizing access to CUI. Does this include all current employees or can you grandfather folks? So Rob, I'm going to kick this one over to you to start us off.
Okay, excellent question, by the way. So according to the rule, everybody must be screened. So therefore, if you've got folks that have been dealing with CUI for numerous years, and now all of a sudden this rule is coming to effect, you will probably more than likely have to screen them again so that you have that document for each one of your users. What you screen for is entirely up to you as an organization. Most that we see, the average that we see is, U.S. citizenship. They do financial, DMV for vehicles if they're driving, those kinds of things. So again, you guys kind of determine what is best to be screened for your organization, but those that have been dealing with CUI for a while and have not been screened must go back and get screened.
Excellent. Next question, Lauren. So Thomas, I'm going to throw this one your way. For non-cloud MSPs, subcontractors, what will CMMC assessments for the prime contractor include to show the subs are CMMC compliant?
So first of all, I just want to point out that given my location today, I realized that the lighting makes me look like a side quest in a video game. One of the reasons why that came to mind is this is kind of like one of those side quests to CMMC. Given this additional scenario, can you satisfy the requirement? So non-cloud MSPs subs. We all are aware that the proposed rule 32 CFR dropped back in December. We've all submitted comments and questions, and we're all waiting for bated breath to see how they're going to be answered. This is honestly one of the items that personally I want DoD to clarify. However, if you look at the current guidance, and when I say current guidance, I'm referring to NIST 800-171, CMMC documentation, scoping, level 2 assessment guides. If you are non-cloud, i.e. you are not an ESP, an external service provider, then that would take the sentence in DFAR 7012 out to where you have to be FedRAMP moderate or equivalent. So what does that make you? To me, honestly, this should be treated as any other external individual that you're allowing to access your organization or your information, whether it be from a maintenance context, true visitor context, or whatever. So at that point in time, the onus of the organization will be to identify what their processes and procedures are, and then show that you're doing them. So for instance, in CMMC, you have a whole ton of RPOs out there helping organizations get ready. Some of those RPOs, they may allow access to their facilities. Some of them may allow access to systems or services to help them prepare, so on and so forth. They're not external service providers as it's currently understood, i.e. cloud or, in an amorphous location. The rub on this is if when the final rule is established, the agency does not make a distinction between cloud and non-cloud MSPs, if they just stick with the MSP designation. And if so, then, as most of the folks on this call have heard me say before, start drinking heavily, because it's going to be a whole new ball game. There's going to be a lot more questions and a lot more folks that may have to get brought to the table at that point. So unfortunately, my answer is right now, you treat them like you would any other visitor, external entity coming into your environment. Got to wait for the final rule to see what the final determination is going to be.
Excellent. Thank you. Next question, Lauren. Okay, so how do I determine if a system is in scope? And we actually get this question a lot, especially when you're talking about the SSP and trying to define your CUI boundaries. What is in scope? What is out of scope? Rob, from an assessor's point of view, you kind of want to give us your take on how you determine if something is in scope?
Yeah, actually, that should probably be Thomas, because it's his favorite thing to say all the time. It's
That's
if
fine.
it
I'll let you throw it to
processes,
Thomas then.
if it processes, stores, or transmits CUI data, it is in scope. So if you're leveraging a cloud solution, that is in scope. If you are leveraging on-prem and cloud, they are both in scope. So wherever that CUI data is residing, how it's being transported, etc., all of that is in scope for the assessment.
Any follow-ups on it, Thomas, since it's your favorite topic?
So again, favorite is a loaded term, but no, I mean, Rob's correct. I mean, at the end of the day, what we have to go on right now is the scoping guides. And when you're looking at level 2 assessment, there's really 2 types of assets that can be held accountable to all 110 at this point in time. If an asset stores, processes, or transmits CUI, as Rob mentioned, are they in scope? Absolutely. The other one is if it's providing security protection for those assets that store, process, or transmit CUI, then they're in scope. So if you're going down your asset list, ask yourself those questions. If your answer is yes, be prepared to show the evidence. That's the best advice I can give you.
And we saw a hand come up real quick. I don't know if they still had a question.
Yeah, Jill dropped a question in the Q&A here. If an organization has passed, and Mike's got his hand up as well, so we'll get to you next, Mike. But Jill's question was, if an organization has passed a DIBCAC high, and they got a perfect 110 score on that DIBCAC high, does that make them eligible for a level 2 final cert? Correct me if I'm wrong here, guys, but you would still need to go through the CMMC certification assessment performed by a C3PAO, regardless of if you have had a DIBCAC high assessment done in the last couple of years or even within the last year. And, if you had a perfect 110 score, you still need to go through the C3PAO driven CMMC certification assessment, unless that DIBCAC high assessment was done under the joint surveillance assessment where a C3PAO was involved doing the 800-171 assessment in coordination with DIBCAC. Outside of that, if it was just your standard DIBCAC high, you still are going to need to go through a C3PAO for the CMMC assessment. So
yeah, I'll give you an example real quick, Jeremy, just to illustrate that for folks. There was one organization that honestly had a DIBCAC high last year during the summer. They actually had to undergo joint surveillance then in the fall to qualify for the joint surveillance program for the conversion to CMMC. So they literally went through 2 of them within the course of several months.
Yeah, we also had a prime that did that too. They had a DIPCAC high and then turned around and went through the joint surveillance. The whole piece is that C3PAO. I'm glad this question came up, because one thing for you guys to know is if you are contacted by DIPCAC to schedule your DIPCAC high assessment, you can always ask them that you would like this to be a joint surveillance assessment. I mean, the first thing they're going to ask you is, have you partnered with a C3PAO yet? But you can ask them and they will flip you into that category as well.
And it really is to your advantage to flip it into a joint surveillance so that you don't have to go back through that second assessment. So, Rob, do you want to grab Mike's question that he posted in the chat?
Sure, unless you want to come on, Mike, and ask it.
Yeah, you're definitely welcome to turn your camera on and chat.
Sure. Well, my camera's kind of blocked via policies, but
Okay.
so question is like you were talking about the scope a little bit earlier in regards to, like, I have a kind of like a simple example, but it's actually more complicated, but I'll just give a simple example in this regard, right? So let's say you have a switch and you're separating traffic, right? Logically, pretty much via VLAN segmentations, right? So one VLAN passes CUI, the other VLAN doesn't. Like, you know, like you only have one device that does this, for example. Like, would that be considered in scope? Or how would you actually kind of like present that type device or whatever?
Go ahead, Thomas. I see you.
So, well, in full disclosure, Mike, I was typing away at your question when Jeremy saw it. So it goes back to what I was saying. Does that switch store, process, or transmit CUI? Yes or no? If it's providing VLAN segmentation, then at some point in time, the presumption is that CUI will be transmitted through that switch to the appropriate VLAN. The other way that you can look at this is that minimum is probably going to be providing security protection, given that it's doing segmentation of your network. It's making sure the traffic is going into the appropriate VLANs and making sure, you know, let's say it's a layer 3 switch and you have your ACLs on there, making sure that the traffic corresponds to the correct ACL and preventing anything else from coming in there. So if it's in your boundary, if it stores, processes, transmits CUI, or provides security protection, then yes, it's in scope.
Yep.
Yeah, gotcha. Thank you.
The main things we'll look at, Mike, for that is, one, configurations. How are, you know, do you have baseline configurations established for the network devices? And then the second thing is who has access to that device in order to make adjustments. This is where separation of duty comes in. You know, can they go in and make adjustments remotely? If so, that needs to be identified as a remote execution for privileged commands. So it all kind of ties together.
Gotcha. Thank you.
Okay. So back to the pre-submitted questions. We have a question of how easy is it to scope changes when CUI is being created by a contractor versus just receiving and storing the CUI? And Thomas, I'll throw this one your way.
Sure. So I'm going to say it's a loaded question, but at the end of the day, scope doesn't change.
Yeah.
Go back to what I just said, what Jeremy and Rob joke around about as being my favorite thing to say. And I would qualify, I have another saying that I've beat into you gentlemen's heads that probably resound more often than that one. But if within your environment, if it stores, processes, or transmits CUI or provides security protection for it, then it's in scope, plain and simple. Current CMMC level 2 scoping guide says it. The draft versions of the items that were released with the proposed rule pretty much says the same thing. That's what's trained to in your CCP certifications. That's what's trained to in your CCA certifications. Ask yourself those questions. If the answer is yes, then it's in scope. Folks always struggle. What's in scope? I don't know how to determine my scoping, so on and so forth. Easiest way to do it, guys, create your asset list, your asset categorizations. Go down the list. Or do any of those devices meet one of those two criteria? If the answer is yes, guess what? Now you've identified what the scope of your assessment is going to include.
Yep. And to add on to that, so CUI is CUI, whether you're creating it or whether you're receiving it. This is going to surround where are you storing it and how are you protecting it. This is where FIPS 140-2 validated encryption comes into play. So whether, if you're leveraging a cloud and that's where all of your CUI is living, it doesn't matter if you've created it or somebody else did, it still has to be protected. And it should not adjust the scope. What should adjust the scope is, as Thomas is getting at, those different protection assets that are kind of in line across the network. That's what will affect the scope, not so much the CUI.
Yeah, I think you guys handled that perfectly. Lauren, I think we got one more on the pre-submitteds. Okay, so much like Thomas has his soapboxes, I've got one of my own, and this definitely kind of falls in my arena. So, there is a question here about essentially what it boils down to is when will the CMMC requirements be pushed down by the prime contractors? And, specifically, I'm going to focus on level 2. What is the most aggressive likely stance and timeline that a large prime will create and enforce for CMMC flow down? And then further on, it asks about, by what means would it be both legal and practical for the prime to enact negative consequences? So I'm going to remind everybody that CMMC is not something completely new. It is an enforcement mechanism for the DFARS regulations that have been on the books since 2017. So if you are operating on a contract as a flow down with the 7012 clause in it, you have been obligated to meet 800-171 and follow DFARS compliance since 2017. So as far as, the legal basis for it or practical basis for a prime enacting negative consequences, the negative consequences are going to be they're going to move their contract to someone else. Something that isn't talked about a lot is that there was a revision made to DFARS 7018. We talk about 7012 all the time, but 7018 had a revision to it that essentially allows the DoD to pull a contract without recourse from a prime and award it to someone else if they feel the original prime subcontractor tree poses a greater than acceptable risk. I'm sort of reading between the lines and thinking that means, okay, one prime's contractor tree is compliant and another's isn't. To jump back to that middle paragraph there about, what's potentially the most aggressive stance. The most aggressive stance is, if CMMC were to go live October 1, the following week, primes start pushing flow down requirements. I don't think they'll begin within a week, but I absolutely do believe they will begin before year end. Rob, Thomas, myself, all of us on our team, and the contractors that we work with, we've been seeing some of the most creative legalese I've ever seen in my entire career surrounding primes and flow down contracts and the NIST 800-171 requirements they're putting in them without officially requiring a CMMC certification, but essentially requiring a perfect 110 score in respect to 800-171. So they're already pushing for it because of that revision to DFAR 7018. And I tell everyone, if you operate in a subcontractor capacity, even if you have some contracts that are direct from the DoD, if you work others in a subcontractor role, you're going to see CMMC requirements in those contracts well ahead of the DoD direct contracts. So hope that answers the question. I can go on for a long time on this one, so feel free to ping me, direct, and I'm happy to chat about it and talk through specifics. So, I believe that was our last pre-submitted question. Am I correct on that, Lauren?
I think so.
Yeah.
If I can add on to this, though, if you go out to our resource center on redspin.com, we recently did a podcast with BAE Systems, and they're a prime. So we kind of wanted to get their perspective of how they were actually going to push the flowdown requirements and the CMMC certifications to their subs. It's an interesting listen. Now, BAE is only one of the subs of many. Now, each one could probably do it different, but their perspective is probably what most organizations, most of those primes are going to follow. So go out and take a listen to that.
Yeah, absolutely. That was that's a good one. And there's a wealth of material on that resource center on our website that is all free. It's just there for everyone to leverage and assist them in their own CMMC preparation efforts. So I tell everybody, go hit it, pillage it to your heart's content. Anything that you can find that you can get value out of for your team's efforts, definitely grab it. So, so at this point, we're just going to kind of open it up to you guys. And, if people want to jump out on camera or unmute themselves and ask questions, drop them in the chat, drop them in the QA, and we'll be happy to work through them.
Jeremy, just to point out, since we're getting started in this phase, Mike Schneider has dropped a comment in the Q&A.
I see that. So Mike dropped in CRMA devices that connect to our Azure GCC High. These are managed in commercial side of our company. What audit requirements should we focus on for these CRMA machines, since they do not transmit, process, or store CUI?
Just to clarify that the CRMA are physical devices and they're connecting just through Azure, like remote desktop, to Azure virtual machines. So they're really just they're almost just like an internet connection.
Mike, I apologize. I
could barely
you
hear
either kind
you.
of broke up
Yeah.
or you were very low on your mic.
Sorry.
I think I missed a key point there.
Sorry, is that any better?
A little bit.
Yep.
Okay, just to clarify on that, the CRMA are physical devices like laptops, and they're all connecting through like remote desktop to the Azure virtual machines. Just to clarify that, so they're basically just a display of the
Right.
virtual
I think
machines. Yep.
I think I'm tracking where you're going.
Yeah.
So it's basically the RDP. Right.
Exactly.
Let me ask you this question, Mike. Since you're utilizing VDI to connect to the GCC High environment, do you restrict the VDIs or that remote connection to where you can't cache or copy and paste information out of that virtual environment to the physical system?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes, we have those enforcements locked down.
Yeah. So if you do have that, what I would expect during the course of the assessment is for, at most, if they are classified as CRMA, those would be governed by the organizational's security requirements. An assessor may do a spot check just to make sure you're doing them, but they have to be identified in your SSP as such. Now, depending upon the connections or the configurations that you have for the virtual component, i.e. the VDI, if you can show that there's no way, shape, or form that CUI can get out of there, you may even be able to mark it as out of scope for your endpoints and leave your scope boundary to that VDI connection.
Now we'll still take a look at the configuration management, which is your baseline configurations for those devices. But yeah, they would pretty much be out of scope, providing you've locked that VDI connection or the RDP down.
Yep. Okay. Thank you, gentlemen.
Any others?
Nicole just dropped one.
Yeah, I'm
Okay.
going back and forth
Yep.
between Q&A and chat.
I have as well. Okay, so Nicole dropped in here. Are bills of materials for parts linked to government contracts considered to be CUI? If so, how can a company use its ERP system, MRP system, when the systems are also used by its sister company in the UK, where non-US persons are possibly able to access those same bill of materials?
Well, that's easy. So first question I would have for you, Nicole, is does the government, i.e. your contracting officer in this case, do they identify those bill of materials as CUI? That's the first question you need an answer to. The answer is yes, then it falls into line for CMMC level 2. If the answer is no, you can go on about your day. So that's the first question you need to answer. The second question you need to answer is, if the answer to my first question is yes, those are considered CUI, then is it CUI basic or is it CUI specified? And if it's CUI specified, does the specification include a dissemination limitation, i.e. no foreign for export controlled or something similar? If the answer to that is yes, then those ERPs, those MRPs, if you're using cloud type platforms, they would kind of fall into the CSP if you're storing them on there. And that's where you would be held accountable to your DFARS 7012 requirements for it to be FedRAMP moderate or equivalent. If it doesn't have those dissemination limitations, if it doesn't have those exclusions such as no foreign, you may be fine, even if it's CUI basic. CUI basic does in and of itself doesn't have dissemination limitations. So I would answer those questions, and then that should tell you what you need to do in those circumstances.
And for everybody listening, if you ever have any questions like that, always reach back out to the contracting POC for clarification.
Yeah, it's not a good answer, but unfortunately, it's the answer that's applicable at this point in time. And as I know folks have probably heard me mention before, DOD's acknowledged they haven't done a very good job of training their own folks on CUI, let alone, the rest of us. But
Yeah.
It's up to the executive agent of that CUI to identify whether it's CUI or not.
Yep. If there's
Great
no
answer.
other questions, I got something we can kind of talk about, because this is something Thomas and I have run into during the course of a few assessments we've completed, and then leverage DIBCAC to get the answer of it. So the scenario is an organization has firewalls that are FIPS 140-2 validated encryption capable, and they are doing a refresh and an upgrade of their firewalls. But the newer firewalls come with 140-3 validated, or 140-3 encryption, but it's still being tested. So how does that affect the assessment? And I'll pause so you guys can think about that, because somebody's got a hand up. I think it's
Yeah, I was going to say,
Nathan.
at the moment you mentioned the firewalls and FIPS, Nathan raised his hand. So Nathan, you want to jump in here?
So
Yes,
fast,
sir.
it's probably on fire.
Oh man, thank you guys. Yeah, actually, I mentioned this at the CMMC day last year, and Robert spoke on this briefly.
Yeah.
And I just passed the CCP exam last week, so they talked a bit
Congrats,
about
Nathan.
this. Thanks,
Yeah.
guys.
Congratulations.
Yeah.
So one of the slides they showed, and this it reminded me what you were just talking about, and I'll share my screen here if I may. I guess I can't have the share screen feature.
Yeah, I don't think so.
And if
Um,
it's official CCP training, we also
no,
don't want to
this
get
actually, this
any of
wasn't from that. This was a website that they just shared from the training. It's public from
Okay.
DCMA. It was
Mhm.
DFARS FAQ slides is what was one of the things. But
Gotcha.
they have a question here. Do all of the 171 security requirements for cryptographic modules have to be FIPS validated? And if so, what does that mean? Right? And they have a long paragraph saying, yeah, basically everything has to be FIPS 140-2, which is, I thought 140-3 would be the thing eventually. But towards the end of the paragraph, they have this one sentence I wanted to ask for your clarification on, guys. It says here, FIPS validated cryptography is required whenever the encryption is required to protect covered defense information in accordance with NIST SPA 171 or by another contract provision. Fine. And this is the question here. Encryption used for other purposes, such as within applications or devices within the protected environment of the covered contractor information system, would not need to be FIPS validated.
That is
Period.
correct. That is correct.
So that was wanting to get clarification from you on that, Robert. And what does that
Yeah.
look like in practice? How can we better architect and engineer that for clients?
So first of all, this is where, the boundary must really clearly be defined of what's in scope versus what's out of scope. The other piece is the boundary firewall should be enabled so that FIPS 140-2 is operating. If that's the case, then your entire boundary is considered secure. Thus, anything that's stored within that boundary falls under the FIPS 140-2 validated encryption from the firewall piece, right? Unless it's being backed up somewhere else. And I know you're smiling, Thomas, so obviously I didn't articulate something properly. Go ahead.
No, I just want to clarify your statement on
Right.
if FIPS is enabled, then your environment is secure. Not necessarily.
Right. That's what I said. There's nuances. Yeah.
Yeah. So essentially, what this is speaking to is information that is leaving your boundary. How are you protecting the confidentiality of that CUI? So if another mechanism other than your firewall is not providing that FIPS 140-2 encryption currently, then what is the mechanism that's being used to transmit it? What is providing that cryptographic protection? At the end of the day, it boils down to really those items in SC, and specifically in your example, data in transit and the CUI encryption, those two areas. So when you're architecting the environment, you're absolutely correct. Within the boundary, it doesn't necessarily have to be. But when you're leaving the boundary, what's providing that cryptographic protection if you're using encryption? That's what you have to determine. And if it's the firewall that's providing it, Rob is absolutely correct. The firewall has to meet the validation requirements. The caveat that I thought was where you were going, Rob, was with the deprecation of FIPS 140-2 in that logjam for 140-3, how should organizations address it? So for any of you any of you old hats that have been around the DoD for a while, do you remember the terminology of temporary deficiencies? That's where this is going. That if the certified module has essentially reached a historical designation within the NIST registry, but they are currently working to FIPS 140-3. They have submitted it, they're waiting in line, so on and so forth. At the time of your implementation, was the module validated and current? If the answer is yes, and they are working towards FIPS 140-3, they provided you with proper attestation to this. The way it's currently being tracked in joint surveillance is it will not count against you as an item being not met. However, it will be required to be placed on your official POEM and tracked to conclusion once the determination for FIPS 140-3 has been made.
Yep.
So I thought that's where you were going.
That was where I was going, yeah.
Okay.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right. I'm going to change directions a little bit here. And by the way, everybody, Nathan dropped into the chat the link to the DFARS FAQ slide that he was talking about.
Yeah,
So
and
if
that was
anybody wants
published
to check
by DCMA DibCAC.
Yep.
So
Um,
that fact sheet.
But Jim dropped a question in here that I know multiple people have to be, dealing with, which is we've received emails from up the chain that say, quote unquote, may contain UI. What should we be doing to manage handling this type of vague information? Because, the DoD labels everything perfectly. Everything is very clear and concise.
Well, first of all, you need to take your drink and add some stiffer stuff to it.
But yeah, I mean, obviously, we hear this all the time in conversations with folks of, either things aren't labeled CUI, but obviously should be, or you get vague, labeling like that of may contain. So how do you handle something that says may contain? Do you treat it as CUI? Do you not treat it as CUI? Where do you go with it?
So I'll go first, and then Thomas can clarify for me, because obviously I'm not articulating well today. I've had enough Red Bulls. So basically, the best practice to do here is if you're unsure, treat it as if it is CUI. That way you are covered, because there's no real good answer for you right now. We do have a lot of organizations that we talk with. The main thing is you need to have a procedure in place in case you receive something like that could be CUI and not marked properly. How are you going to kind of address that? We always tell folks, if you're unsure, just treat it like that. This is where media protection comes into play, the MP domain, because you can decontrol anything that you have in there, providing you're the owner of said CUI. Go ahead, Thomas.
No, sorry, you clarified the statement that I raised my eyebrows on. The only person that can declassify CUI, just as a reminder, is the executive agent. So if at least in this scenario, you're kind of right. And I put a comment in the chat that's kind of tongue in cheek, but to me, and this is going back to my DISA days, this is the DoD equivalent of CYA. Hey, we don't know, so treat it as such, and until we tell you as otherwise. Exactly. The reason why, honestly, they may be saying it, and it's a legitimate reason, is the DoD may not be the executive agent over that. I'm going to give you an example. Who's the executive agent for ITAR? It's not DoD, Department of State. So the DoD may have to go to the executive agent at the Department of State to say, hey, is this CUI or isn't it? So that's kind of their statement that they're doing to honestly cover themselves until they get clarification on it.
That's a great insight. Thank you. We got some new ones as
I don't
well.
see anything in the chat that's new.
Nope. Okay.
Nothing on Q&A that's new. You guys are being quiet today.
Well, we got
Jeannie's got her hand up. Thank you, Jeannie. Go ahead.
Yeah, jump in.
Yeah. Sorry, I'm like trying to get that. I don't use Teams anymore. I use Slack. But I have a question specifically. I put it in their chat earlier and then I got disconnected. So I keep hearing boundary, but correct me if I'm wrong. I don't see anything that specifically specifies that in order to be CMMC level 2.0 compliant, you need to have a physical boundary separating your information that's processing, storing, or classifying CUI. With that being said, it seems very difficult to get the complete scoping of the assessment down if, say, for example, the current asset I have has applications that do store, process, or transmit CUI on it, then the entire asset is within scope, correct?
That's correct.
If I don't have a logical separation?
That is correct.
Okay, so then what if we move our assets that do contain CUI to a FedRAMP moderate or FedRAMP high approved boundary that already has an ATO? Does that change the scope of the work? And the reason I say that is because obviously FedRAMP ATO process takes a little bit longer and more in depth into the controls than NIST 800-171. Can we just this is going to sound weird, but can we grandfather in the controls underneath the FedRAMP ATO assessment into CMMC?
So I see Thomas is typing, so I'll kind of tackle this to start, and I'm sure he's going to clean me up afterwards. But so if you're talking about leveraging a cloud environment that's FedRAMP authorized, then basically you're going to inherit the protections from said cloud provider, because in order to be authorized, they have to be FedRAMP moderate or high, which means they must have the FIPS 140-2 validated encryption in place. The other piece is equivalency that's now out. We've seen Prevail, which is also a cloud service provider, that has not gone through the FedRAMP authorization process, but they did go through the equivalency process where DIBCAC assessed them, and they got blessed off. So there's two forms that now avenues for cloud service providers of how they can kind of go about being certified, I guess is the best way to say it, to provide services. If you're taking said applications and you are putting those in the cloud environment, then that kind of goes back to the conversation we had earlier about using remote desktop or virtual desktop infrastructure, where you can access that cloud environment. If as long as you've got controls on that connection piece that blocks folks from screenshots, blocks them from downloading, et cetera, then pretty much that asset comes out of scope. And
it comes out of scope.
Yeah, because your applications are sitting up in the cloud environment and you're blocking everything from being able to be loaded to that laptop. Now, that's just some way folks tackle it. Others say, no, we don't want to take those devices out because we want them to put, continue to keep CUI on that. If that's the case, that device is now in scope. I hope I didn't confuse you.
No, you did not confuse me.
Okay.
There's just two different courses of action that I could take as an enterprise solution to this. And one of the ways that I would like to do it is to take the assets that do process, store, transmit CUI and move it into the FedRAMP authorized boundary. You said it's out of scope. So then if I do that, say I got like 7 applications and I poof them all into the FedRAMP moderate approved boundary, and it's out of scope, how do we get an assessment for CMMC then? If I don't have anything that's in scope anymore, it's all in the FedRAMP ATO boundary.
You still got processes on the back end that you're managing on your network. That's really what we're looking at. Remember, FedRAMP looks out at what they do. CMMC looks back to what you do. So that's the piece. That's the scope and boundary we're kind of trying to discuss. Yeah.
Yeah. So the assessor would inherently then just be looking at the VDI or our RDP.
Correct.
Got it.
Correct.
Okay.
Now
Not necessarily what's contained in the boundary.
Correct. And now where those devices will come into play is configuration management, because we got to look at your baseline configurations, et cetera, make sure they're applied across the entire organization and such. So,
Gotcha.
Yep. And I know we're at time, so we got to pass this back to Lauren.
Thank you.
Yeah, I know a few questions got dropped here in the chat just in the last couple of minutes here. Definitely feel free to reach out to us. We're happy to have lengthier conversations one-on-one, but just to be cognizant of everybody's time, we're going to pass the torch back to Lauren here and let Lauren wrap us up.
Awesome. Thank you all. And thanks attendees for submitting so many questions. I just dropped an email into the chat too. If you want to submit your questions there, that would be really easy for us to follow up with. info@redspin.com. So we are coming to an end. A reminder, at Redspin, we're here to help and are committed to your success. If you have additional questions, don't hesitate to reach out to us. Fill out that contact form on our website or send us an email. Really quick before we officially end, I want to cover a few upcoming events to have on your radar. First, we will be at CMMC Day here in a few weeks, May 6th. We are title sponsors with our friends over at KTL. If you're attending, make sure you stop by our table and say hi, and make sure to catch our speaking sessions. Both Rob and Thomas are speaking. And as a reminder, our next CMMC Connect is May 30th, so a month away. We'll be back with the same format on the Teams platform, but we'll have new questions and new information. Registration details will be shared soon. So remember, again, we're here to help. Feel free to reach out to us. Check our resource hub on our website. Lots of good stuff there. including that newest podcast episode that was mentioned with BAE Systems. With that, we'll go ahead and end today's webinar. Thanks, Rob, Thomas, and Jeremy, and all of our attendees for joining.
Thank
Thanks,
you.
guys.
Have a good one,
Appreciate it.
everyone.
Have a good
Thank
one.
everybody.
Cool. Thank you.
Stay safe but deadly.
Thanks, guys.